entrepreneurs and professionals of Tampa Bay. Welcome to your hour for getting the information, the tools, and the connections for elevating your business. Welcome to Getting the Edge with Kelly Wilson. And here's your host, Kelly Wilson.
Welcome to Getting the Edge. I'm your host, Kelly Wilson. Thank you so much for being with us today. This is round two, I think, of our Getting the Edge out in the community. And it's been a lot of fun getting out of the studio and exploring other places. And so far, we've been in two places that are my favorite, except not that we were surrounded by musical instruments or anything last time at the orchestra, but nonetheless, music is one of my favorites, and so is history. So today we have the pleasure of being at the Tampa Bay History Center with the one and only Rodney Kite-Powell. And welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure having you here.
Thank you. You have no idea what it means for me personally to be here. I mean, you have been just someone I have admired very much for all of your contributions and the writing that you've done. I have very much enjoyed history and spent my first 10 years ago, pretty much now, in writing and just researching for the first publication I had. And everything I came across, it had your name on it. So the fact that I am here with you 10 years later, that you're participating in our upcoming magazine issue, and I'm so excited and then to be here at the museum in his History Center, just
either
to
way,
talk with you.
Yep, we're a museum. Yeah.
It means a lot. So
thank you.
I'm honored completely.
Real pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, it's kind of like one of those things you get to look back and maybe celebrate some small successes that you feel like you've made over time.
Yeah.
You still, the sky's the limit, right? But it's just great too when you can. I was so excited when I got up this morning, and it's really exciting being out. I used to kind of almost you have to hype yourself up to go into the studio to be ready to do the shows, and we would do them back to back, and it was I would be totally happy and excited afterwards because it's great talking and having the conversations, but nonetheless, you have to kind of I'm just very excited to be out and about. So tell us, if you're not familiar with the Tampa Bay History Center, you really need to become familiar with it. Check out the information. I think it's Tampa Bay, is it TB History?
Well, no, TampaBayHistoryCenter.org is our website.
Okay.
And on social media, we're, I think, at Tampa Bay History or, other platforms. You find us by Tampa Bay History.
Well, it's a wowing organization and the building and just the premises and the collection is and they have the Columbia restaurant on site too. It's right down in the water, the Channelside near Water Street, right?
That's the road we're on, Water Street. Right.
It's a great area and you're right in the middle of it.
We are, and so we're located right by Emily Arena in the south end of downtown Tampa, and so. So one of the things we're in the middle of course, is the new Water Street development, or I guess we're at the doorstep of. And so right now, those who are watching or listening in kind of 2021 or even early 2022 may find that it's a little difficult to get here because there's so much construction going on around us. But all that is really great for us and great for the city. It's an incredible amount of construction going on really all across our region, but it's in particular right here on our doorstep.
Just having spent the last 20-some years here and seeing the community rise the way we have, and everyone that we talk with is so exciting to kind of be here in this moment, and to ride through the waves of the future, as far as because we still have so much more growth and so much development that obviously that leads to a lot more excitement too as more things come together.
Exactly. So and it's not just Water Street right here in downtown, but it's in Tampa. It's that Midtown Development, which has been talked about for like 40 years, and it's finally coming to pass.
Yeah, and that is what that is our feature for this new magazine issue. And Bill and Nick Haynes are the father-son duo behind that development. And that is really the storyline behind it. A dream come true after 30 years of just and that longevity piece of the will, to see something come together and to be able to share the vision, with others when there isn't anything to see, right? But being able to passionately just share a vision that you have that. I think timing, anyway, it's just an exciting story. So we're happy to highlight them. And it's a great, again, just so many great areas and communicative, type collaborative efforts that are just a lot of ways for Tampanians to come together, I guess, and tourists. And
well, exactly, and that's the thing is, Tampa really hasn't always been a real tourist destination. It's more of business travelers and people who maybe they go into the beach and they're maybe the third day they're a little sunburned, so they may come to Tampa.
Right.
Obviously, Busch Gardens and Adventure Island are the exceptions to
yes,
that. But
that was always on my list when I was a tourist when I was young.
Exactly.
Yes.
But now there's so many more offerings. Of course, downtown has the Art Museum, the Children's Museum, the Photographic Museum, the Henry Plant Museum across the river, the aquarium, and then Ybor City Museum, all in this same place that you can get to basically either short walks or streetcar rides away. Yeah. And then the zoo, world-class zoo, and as I mentioned, Busch Gardens and Adventure Island. So it's so much to do here now when they're...
And plus all the beaches and just everything surrounding. It's just, and then obviously, as you mentioned, you don't really think of Tampa, as we were talking earlier, you mentioned Tampa being a gateway, to the southern, talk about that a little bit. So
Tampa, and it's something that's been this way for at least 500 years, if not longer, with the indigenous population. But Tampa's this gateway, and Florida itself is a gateway, and it's a connection between the Caribbean, which itself is kind of a connection with the Old World, going back to the European explorations, and then into the interior of North America. So some of the first explorations by Europeans in the 1500s started here in the Tampa Bay area.
Oh, wow.
And then the cigar industry, and then the cattle trade to Cuba. Prior to that, in the 1850s,
cattle trade to Cuba.
Exactly.
So what was that?
So Florida cattle really weren't that great from a kind of a quality beef standpoint until the 20th century. They were really descendants of these early Spanish cattle that were brought here by the Spaniards in the 1500s. So the things we think of as some of the biggest commodities of Florida agriculture, oranges and cattle, and then the wild hogs that are kind of everywhere in the southeast. All of those were brought by the Spanish in the 1500s, and many of them brought literally through the Tampa Bay area. So oranges aren't native to the New World; they're an Old World fruit.
Interesting.
But they're so synonymous with Florida, and it's because they've been here for 500
Florida oranges,
years. Exactly.
Right?
And so, but the cattle that were here were very hardy cattle. They could survive in the scrub that was Florida, but they really weren't, big beef cattle. But in Cuba, they didn't really have any kind of cattle, so having any kind of beef going in was great, and Tampa in the 1850s was the closest port to Havana. And so there were a couple cattlemen, James McKay and William Hooker, who began shipping cattle out of Ballast Point and buy live cattle and then shipping them to Havana. There was actually a really bad drought, I think in 1860, that killed a lot of the cattle here in Tampa. Basically, what is now South Tampa was a big open range. And so they shifted the cattle operations down to the Boca Grande area because there's a little more access to fresh water down there. And so the Ponderosa area and the Boca Grande area began to be a bit of a port for that. And then later, both Tampa and Boca Grande became to be ports for phosphate, and that was shipped literally around the world from here to Tampa.
Well, I'm so excited. You mentioned Henry Plant and the Tampa Bay Hotel, and for the upcoming issue, Rodney wrote an article for us for it, and I'm so again just to have you participating in the publication is such an honor. But even that period when you think of like the Spanish War, right?
Spanish-American War.
That and then all of the soldiers and they were. That was what was that? Was that the flu?
No,
Spanish fever.
So the Spanish influenza was actually during World War I, and so many of the soldiers who were in Europe got the Spanish flu, and really isn't even Spanish flu, but kind of this influenza, and then they came home and they brought it.
It was just during the Spanish-American War, I guess, is why I don't know.
Yeah, you think Spanish flu, it's unrelated to the Spanish-American War, which was 20 years earlier.
Oh, wow. Now, the early 1900s, when we just said that was when the world, I was trying to think, what year was World War I?
So World War I, as far as the American participation, was 1917 to 1918, but it started in 1914. But the U.S. wasn't really involved.
I just think it's wonderful how you know all of this.
It's just all in my head.
I know. Well, I guess it's like with any profession, people know photography or whatever they might know.
It's one of those things.
This is like Google, but just sitting here and like having a personal Google. It's wonderful. But talk to me about you're heading up now the what do you call the section? So do it.
Oh, so right now we are in the Touchton Map Library.
Touchton Map.
Yep. And so so the Touchtons were map collectors beginning in the early 1980s. And Mr. Touchton was one of the founding board members and the founding board chair for the History Center. And so it is their interest in maps that really got them involved in the History Center back in the late 1980s. And so when we finally opened the History Center in 2009, we had a small map gallery on the floor below, on the third floor. But when we expanded the museum in 2018,
what's in the garage?
Exactly. Exactly. But when we expanded the museum in 2018 to build out the fourth floor, we opened the Touchton Map Library, and so this is primarily what I do now. I used to be the curator of the History Center and do all the history stuff, but now we've got a wonderful staff that does that. We're doing very well from the History Center's standpoint. We haven't had this many staff people to focus on the galleries. We've got a curator of Black History, a curator of Public History.
Oh wow.
Folks who handle the collection, or registrar and collections manager. It's really fantastic that we have so many resources now to really help people learn our history.
Right. And it's interesting as we're talking, I think about how history is made, right? Mm-hmm. And just the fact that one day all of this is history. Yeah. Right?
Well, what we've gone through in 2020 and in the beginning of 2021, we actually actively collected materials that related to both the pandemic and to the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of this new civil rights movement.
Right.
Because those are the kind of things that somebody in the future will want to be able to look into and talk about. And so we wanted to make sure people were getting interviewed and could submit their stories. We went and collected signs and things. So we want to make sure that those artifacts, which people don't even think of as being artifacts,
but they will be someday, right?
Exactly, and it's going to be impossible to get 20 years from now. So we want to make sure we get those things now.
Yeah, and somebody has to be thinking about that, ahead of time, like you said, and be in this mindset to think that collectors, we're going to.
Yeah, I mean we're in pretty historic times right now.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are. Which is exactly why I mentioned what I did earlier.
Exactly.
I love being here. What is your favorite part of the History Center?
Well, I guess for my job, the map library is now really where my focus is, and what I really enjoy doing. The collection is over 6,000 pieces that all relate to Florida, but as we talked about earlier, because of Florida's unique place, we are this gateway between the Caribbean and the southeastern United States. So we've got some really great maps that show the evolution of Cuba and Caribbean islands, and of course the growth of the eastern United States. So there's so many things that we can teach with the map collection. And then the rest of the galleries are fantastic. So we've got this really great kind of pirate exhibit and treasure hunting just outside our door. But we cover the Seminoles, we cover sports in the area, we cover all kinds of different things. Of course, the cigar industry.
Mm-hmm. So what about the Seminoles? Like, what do you know? What's some history behind the Seminoles?
Well, so the Seminole Indians of Florida, their story is really interesting and it's pretty unique. They, we think about indigenous people as always being from one place and honestly, unfortunately, having been removed and gone. But we need to remember that there's a pretty large Native American population still in this country, and in Florida too. And so that's currently the Seminoles and the Miccosukee, who are kind of culturally related, but still distinct from a tribal standpoint as well. But,
distinct meaning there are no current members?
Oh, no. They're between the Seminoles and Miccosukee, they're distinct from each other. So their language is kind of analogous to kind of Spanish and Portuguese as far as the differences between the two. They're similar, but not really understandable between the two. And they came from similar places in Georgia and Alabama, but they're still just different enough that they're recognized by the federal government separately as two separate entities. But their story goes back to the early 1700s when Florida belonged to the Spanish. And the original indigenous people of Florida had been basically wiped out through mostly through disease, but through enslavement and warfare with the Europeans. Mm-hmm. So it left this peninsula pretty much wide open. And you also have pressure from the English colonies in the north pushing more people either to the west or to the south. And so people who were called Creeks by the English began moving into Florida and kind of intermingling with the few remaining indigenous people.
And who were the Creeks?
So the Creeks were native people, and they literally lived on creeks.
Oh, okay.
And so the British just kind of applied this name to them. But there are kind of a few different groups that came from what we now call Georgia and Alabama. And so they came in different waves, and so that's where the cultural differences come from, because they kind of different parts of those places, they came in Florida at different times. But by the time the U.S. took over Florida, the U.S. government wanted Florida for settlement by whites, and a section, of course, of the government and people within the government wanted to open Florida up for slavery. And so the Seminoles were in the way of all of that. And also the Seminoles had within their group escaped and freed blacks, people who had left the English colonies and escaped into Spanish Florida. And so if you came to Spanish Florida as a slave and you converted to Catholicism, you'd be free. And so there actually were a lot of free blacks in Florida who became allied with the Seminoles. So anyway, so the federal government didn't like that and didn't like the Seminoles being in the way, and so ultimately they removed or attempted to remove the Seminoles to the west, to the Indian territories, where a lot of the other tribes had been moved to. And so you may have heard the Trail of Tears.
To the west, like going what? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a place, nothing against Oklahoma, but it's entirely different than Florida.
Right.
And so...
you're used to surviving on the land, right? You're used
to... yeah, and this kind of land, this climate, the adjacency to water and all those things, Oklahoma's landlocked.
Right. It'd be different if you had a grocery store down the street, but if you're used to farming and doing what you have to do in our tropical environment, that would be a tough... So they didn't go willingly.
Well, no, as you would imagine. Would you go willingly?
No, absolutely not.
So there was a war that was fought between the U.S. and the Seminoles. It's historically broken up into three different sections. One, actually before Florida became a territory, one in the 1830s that Tampa played a pretty big role in, and then one just before the Civil War. But it resulted in the removal of all but about 800 Seminoles and Miccosukees from Florida. And so it's kind of unknown how many Seminoles died during those wars, but there probably were 6,000 or 7,000 in Florida prior to those wars. So you can kind of do the math and see, almost all of them were removed. But there was just enough to continue and have this culture and not, and be able to avoid intermarriage of families and things like that. And so now you have a really robust culture among the Seminoles and Miccosukees, as well as an incredible business with the Seminoles. They, of course, own the Hard Rock franchise, and from that standpoint, they're doing quite well. But that's very recent. A generation ago, they were not doing as well, but it's just, through some smart decisions and take advantage of the system as it exists.
Right.
They
you might as well get theirs now. I guess after what you've been through.
I don't begrudge. I don't begrudge anything that they have now, knowing what they had to go through to get to it.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that generations had to go. Anyway, there's just so many different cultures. When one of the things that's interesting is I think about hurricanes, obviously being on a peninsula. And then I think about back in the earlier days where you didn't have the weather instruments. We didn't have Doppler radar, right? Let's, what was it, 1918? Was that?
So the last one to hit Tampa was 1921. Last direct hit of a hurricane. Of course, we've had tropical storms and we've had near misses and things like that. But the last landfall in the Tampa Bay area of a hurricane was 1921. Actually made landfall around Tarpon Springs, which is the worst case scenario for the bay, because the counterclockwise motion of the storm pushes the water in if it makes landfall to the north of the bay, and so it was devastating. And you're right, they had a little bit of warning because there was communication, and so they knew there was a storm in the Caribbean.
SOS or that.
But they had telegraph, and they had telephones then, and there weren't radios, but there were telegraphs and telephone systems by then, and you could see the cable, that kind of thing. So they knew from ships in the Caribbean, and they knew from the Keys and from South Florida that there was a storm. But you're right, they had no radar. No real sense of its movement, no sense of tracking the storm.
Or what's actually coming.
Exactly.
Because at some point, something's coming because you can kind of feel it as it approaches, right?
Well, the instruments they had at the time, a barometer, falling barometer, they of course knew what that meant, and storm clouds. I mean, they had a sense of it. Obviously, the more reliant you are on technology, the less reliant you are on your senses. Right. And so they were much more aware of the environment.
They were more used to using those types of. That's why when older people would say, my leg hurts, it's going to rain today or something.
Well, you can still, smell the rain coming.
Oh yeah,
if you're attuned to it.
Yeah, I've unfortunately spent too many years smoking, which I do not recommend to anyone. Oh, yeah. I'm going to quit again soon, but it does, it takes away some of that.
Yeah, exactly.
But I still get it. In fact, when I do, you embrace it because it's. You don't always do. Anyway, it's the right environment and stuff. And if you're in the city, you definitely don't because there's too much pollution everywhere.
Exactly, yeah.
Anyway, that's another whole story. What year was it before that? So 1921 was that, but wasn't there one, was there one late 1800s?
There was one, and the one really before that was severe was 1848, believe it or not. So it was, almost 80 years before.
And there really wasn't much here then. So what year is the Tampa Bay Hotel?
It was built in 1891. And so in 1848, you had the town of Tampa. And you had the military fort that was just to the north.
Fort Brooke?
Fort Brooke, exactly.
I love it. It's so interesting, all the dates and how things correspond. Okay, go ahead.
Well, so, and that storm was far worse from a, of course they don't know for sure, but again, looking at the barometric pressure and things like that, they, I think, have said that the 1848 storm would have been equivalent to a Category 3 storm, where the 1921 was
same place?
That's a great question. I don't know. It definitely made landfall to the north. So the Pinellas Peninsula is where it would have made landfall because of the storm surge. It brought in a tremendous amount of water into the bay, totally flooded the village of Tampa, which basically was everything everything north of Whiting Street. So those of you who can kind of picture, or of course look up a map of downtown Tampa, actually, we can maybe pop one in and post here. But you can see from Whiting Street to Harrison and the river to what was called East Street. That was basically all of Tampa at that time, and there were 500 people living
there. I always think of Whiting because I don't know why. If I have to go back around and loop to Ashley, maybe. Then is that Hattrick's or what's that?
Yeah,
it's right there.
Yeah, Hattrick's is just south
the parking garage is right there.
Yeah, the Fort Brooke garage.
Right, that's what it is. So maybe I park there and I would walk out sometimes. But I really remember seeing the street sign it seemed like it was a bridge, but that is.
There's a pedestrian crosswalk, I think, that goes from one side of the garage to the other. But that garage is important because it's located on one of the Fort Brooke cemeteries. And they didn't know that until they started building One City Center and the garage in 1980. And they unearthed a couple hundred sets of remains, both soldiers and Seminoles. The reason why the Seminoles have the reservation that they have on I-4 is, or off I-4, is because of that cemetery. Because there were Seminole remains there. There was a kind of a trade of land and a place for them to reinter those remains in the proper ceremonial way. And so that was kind of the land grant that they were given.
Now, Fort DeSoto, is that, that was obviously a fort similar to Fort Brooke. What year was that?
Well, so Fort DeSoto came quite a bit later. You brought up the Spanish-American War. So in the summer of 1898, the U.S. went to war with Spain over the question of Cuba's independence. Also, there was a ship called the Maine that blew up mysteriously in Havana Harbor, and they thought, the U.S. government, or enough people thought within the government, that, and the press at the time, that the Spanish had dbe but it actually turned out to be an accident. And so we went to war with Spain. And Cuba, over that,
but it turned out to be an accident.
Yeah, okay. And so, but the idea was to help liberate Cuba. The Cuban people had started a revolution in 1895 against Spain. It was still a Cuban colony at that time, and there were so many cigar makers here in Tampa because of the cigar industry. They were Cubans. Tampa, in particular, was really involved in that revolution. And then, when it came time for the Spanish-American War, the government decided to use Henry Plant's railroads, or the one railroad, and his steamships and other ships that they could get, and actually ship out the soldiers, the American soldiers, from Tampa to Cuba to fight that war. There also was fear that the Spanish would try and attack Tampa. And so they thought, well, we need some forts to reinforce the bay. And so Fort DeSoto on Mullet Key, so kind of close to the mainland of Pinellas County, actually it was Hillsborough County still at that time, was established. And then Fort Dade on Egmont Key was established. And so you had these big, what they call disappearing guns. And so it was basically a gun on a
that would roll back?
Lever.
Yeah.
Well, actually on a lever, so it would kind of pop up over the parapet, you could fire it, and it would pop back down, so you wouldn't exactly see where the guns were, so you can't go shoot at them. And the interesting thing about Fort Dade is it's almost entirely underwater at this point, at least the fort part of it on Egmont Key, because we're losing Egmont Key.
Right. Oh, is that
so
no? Because I know
washed away, by tidal action. Yeah.
So, because you used to be able to take a ferry, right?
Oh yeah, and you still can. Egmont exists, but the western edge, the Gulf side, that's where a lot of the fortifications were, and they're literally underwater now.
I did not know that.
Not the entirety of it.
It's been a long time. I actually really like Fort DeSoto. I love the sun, and I like the beach there because you can park and
it's a great beach.
It's quiet, or then and it's a state park, so I feel like I'm giving back or supporting the. Anyway, those parks, but
but you're right. You can take the ferry to Fort Dade from Fort DeSoto, and there's a lot in Egmont. There's still a lot to see on Egmont, but again, that western edge.
How big is it then? That's seeable.
Gosh, there's still acres and acres. Of it.
Okay.
There's a lighthouse that's still there, and there's there are a lot of buildings and brick roads. There actually was a pretty elaborate fort there, and there are people who lived on Egmont for quite some time, and there are still people who live on Egmont at the south end. All of the shipping pilots who help guide, actually literally bring the ships into the port, they have a little village down there, and so they stay overnight if they're kind of on their 24-hour shift or whatever their shift happens to be. So there still are folks who live on Egmont Key. Interesting.
I didn't know that. I enjoy Fort DeSoto. I love history, and I love being in places where you can just picture that. That you can still walk through, like St. Augustine.
Oh my gosh, yeah, St. Augustine. That's incredible.
So what year was that?
So St. Augustine was established in 1565.
Oh my goodness.
So it's really old. Yeah, it's the oldest. It has some qualifiers. It's the oldest continuously occupied European-founded city in
that's kind of like Bayshore Boulevard. It's the longest continuous sidewalk, blah, 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 okay.
So St. Augustine is incredible. And so the Castillo de San Marcos isn't that old. It was built in the 1700s. But there are buildings that date back to the early 17th century, so the 1600s.
There are some I refuse to go in.
They're all at this point, because of modern, building codes and things like that. They've all been reinforced.
But you still don't know what's lurking.
Yeah, that's
you can't
true.
see. I don't know.
There's some really great things there. It's a wonderful city.
Oh, it's definitely one of my favorites. It's very quaint and like eclectic almost and just so rich in history. It just is surrounding you. Which I just didn't. Sometimes I don't think we think about the time frames of different. I was even researching biblically different things that happened. AD and after and BC but I don't think even Egyptian type things. And I didn't really know how they all correlated. And you don't think. Anyway, it's a lot of years in between everything.
It's really it's interesting to think because you get so kind of your mindset goes, well, ancient history, that all happened in one place. You think about the pyramids and all that kind of stuff. We don't then think about what that exact same time, what was happening over here. Well, of course, there are pyramids being built in South America and Mexico, but of course there are also indigenous people living here in Florida. People had lived in Florida for 12,000 years, 13,000 years.
So what do we mean by indigenous?
So the original population. So the folks who came here, and the theories about how they got here exactly, are still debated, but the land bridge from Russia across Alaska during the Ice Age, or coming up, from Asia to South America, kind of through Central America and Mexico. But however they happened to get here. There's a lot of evidence to show they were here at least 12,000, 13,000 years ago. And Florida at that time, because there was a ice age, Florida was a lot wider. So, right now we're pretty close to the coast, but if we go on our time machine to 12,000 years ago, we would not be near the coast. We'd be maybe 80 to 90 miles away from the west coast of Western Shore because the water levels were so much lower. It's kind of a mind-blowing thing to think about. Yeah.
So you've lost that much land.
To what was then, global warming in a sense, sea level rise. If you go in that time machine and you go 75 miles to the west, you could find people living on coastal villages. And there even has been evidence that just off the coast of the Gulf now, there were remnants of those villages and even burial sites that would have been on land, 9,000-10,000 years ago.
So interesting. There's like so many things as I sit here, and if I have so much time with you, and I only so much time, and I'm just trying to think, there's just so much to ask, because not even just from a Tampa perspective, but just overall, like what just blows you away that fascinates you, like maybe a storyline, or not even in regards to Tampa. Okay, well, let's do two choices. Let's do one outside of Tampa and beyond. So ancient history. What? So
it's funny. So like all my history, kind of the stuff that I've liked about history, has all been fairly modern. Like my mom really loved ancient history, and I don't know really what it was about that she liked. But you think about it, some of the things I think that kind of can span time is how people were able to use the technology that they had to do the things that they did. And because it's so easy for us to look back in time and see, well, these people are primitive and they couldn't do anything because we've all got all the great stuff.
They didn't have the technology and everything that we have.
But they had they had incredible technology. And two, they were able to just to do things. One, because they didn't have the distractions. I was quoted in the paper a few weeks ago about, how does somebody, there was a story about this guy who was this kind of adventurer in the early 20th century. And so the reporter said, well, like, how does somebody even do that? I said, well, they weren't distracted by all the nonsense
Facebook
we have.
Posts weren't going on,
think about how much time, and I don't say it's wasted time, but it's time devoted to other things. But if you didn't have, when people didn't have a TV to watch, or like I said, Facebook posts or Twitter messages to deal with, and their Instagram and their other stuff, I mean, you have a lot of time to think and read and just do stuff. We talk to our kids all the time.
Sometimes that's the way I've tried to live.
It's okay to be bored, because when you're bored, then you can start thinking about other things. You don't always have to be bored,
because it's something you could always be doing or learning, right?
Exactly.
And that it always drove me crazy when my kids would say that.
Yeah, but not having those distractions that we have now. But it's the point we've come as a society that we have so much leisure time. But you think, what's the downside of that? And it could be this loss of more people thinking about these things. I think you're always going to have innovators. You're always going to have people who are inventing things, but I think there are fewer people who are doing it.
I think there's less there's just too many that don't believe in their ability to do something.
Well, that's true too.
There was I like How Was It Made, or I don't know, one of those shows that are on, or even Can You Believe That? I don't know, just one of those. But it was talking about, it looked like this light bulb, and it had all kinds of gadgets coming out of it, and it, like, they even joke like something from Frankenstein or something, but really small, and but they were like, you won't believe what this does. But it allowed communication, but I think it was more of the Morse code, but because initially, I guess, and you might even know what it's called when they get to it, because I don't remember, of course, but they were saying when ships would go out, that there was no communication until this device finally allowed the airways to travel, I guess, through the water. But this was like the first time that had, they had been able, because they were like, otherwise these ships were blind. They had no communication from the land, and this little device, and I don't remember, there was a few people.
Heard of that. That's really interesting.
I got to share something historic. I don't really know it. It's kind of like a quote that I don't know the whole quote about. But anyway, it was. So then there were a few that developed it, that came in and added more to this over their years of our generations. But and then that's how ultimately we ended up with our, sonar and all of the stuff we have today. I don't understand it all. But it's just interesting how the idea that somebody stands up and makes history. That, because most of the time, like the Midtown project we were just mentioning, for 30 years he's staying consistent on something he believes in. You look at so many innovators that people don't see their vision. So they're immediately outcast, or, they're they're removed.
Yeah.
Right? And so you just, anyway, but it's great to those that have the strength and the belief within them. And I think that's what sharing stories and a lot of things can do is convince or help others realize they can do things too. That's what the EDGE kind of philosophy is all about, is sharing it all. But so what do you look for in anything exciting going on in the fall with?
Well, the fall of 2021, we've got lots of programs coming up. Of course, with COVID still being part of our lives, we are doing a lot of things in a hybrid way. So we are having people come here. Of course, the museum's open for visitors.
And it's scheduled? Like, do you purchase time frames?
Exactly.
So you have limited?
Well, actually, no. We did, when we first reopened last year, we did have timed entry and limited gallery space, but it's pretty roomy in here, and so we don't limit that. Yeah. But as far as our programs go, we are doing in-person lectures, but those lectures are also shared on our Facebook, so they're through Facebook Live.
Oh, okay.
So people can actually participate live. So if they can't come here, if they don't feel comfortable coming here, and if they have questions, they can type their questions in, and we'll get them answered by the speaker.
Well, sometimes too, even just the travel time is not allowed between schedules, and now school's back in, and this way you can accommodate.
And
it's one thing we can take away, right?
Well, it is. It's one of those things. Obviously, you try and find the silver lining in things. And the idea of doing something like this. So we previously would generally just have a program. It would be in person. We'd have 100 people, and that was it. But now we can have a program, and it's one of those things you just didn't think about. I'm sure some institutions did, but we never really instituted this. But you have something that's live, and it's not only you can't get here because your kids are in school or because you don't want to get COVID, but you're in England or you're in China or Australia or Michigan or wherever, but you can still tune in. And you can still participate. And so that's what's so great about doing these hybrid programs. And so even,
So who are some of the speakers and some of the things you have upcoming?
I actually am doing one.
How about you?
Yeah, mine's, when is mine? Mine's, I think, on the 14th, September 14th.
Okay.
And so we have an exhibit here in the Map Gallery on the Florida Territory. And so that's the topic of my talk. And then you brought up the hurricane of 1921. The October program is going to be talking about that, because this is the 100th anniversary of the 1921 hurricane.
That'll probably be in October.
Yeah, of course.
Right,
exactly.
Yeah, and you kind of almost think we're getting out of the season. The worst ones.
Hurricane season goes through November, and from our standpoint, the storms that spring up in the Gulf are the ones that have the highest probability of hurting us. And historically speaking, those Gulf storms are more common September, October, November. So our hurricane season
is just begun.
Exactly.
Right, we have so much to look forward to. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, you have to take the good with the bad. We talk about that all the time.
Exactly.
There's no perfect, situation in anything.
Yeah. Go to San Diego and they have
oh goodness, yes.
Earthquakes and things like that. So there's always some. I know there's different things have done. What's the safest city in the country? It's who knows where, but I think we're pretty good here.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well, so what about yourself? Any plans for the future? Or do you have anything in the works, or what?
No, actually, I've written a few books, and I actually don't have a current book project, and so I'm sure I'll think of something interesting to write about. But just
trying
to make
editing. You probably do. Do you enjoy editing?
I really don't do any of that. I certainly wouldn't mind that, but I generally just am the one creating the content, and somebody else is doing the editing.
Right.
But then also just want to make sure the History Center keeps growing, and we want to make sure we're in a good place now. We want to continue to be in a really good place, and be able to educate all of those folks who are moving into the towers next door and Water Street and coming to Midtown and coming from all over the place, coming here, and we want to make sure that if they're living here, that they learn our history so they can appreciate it.
And it's not just for tourists that come through, right? And I think that's whether it's the Florida Aquarium or the orchestra or everything, that so many of these wonderful, just community-focused nonprofits, offer for our community. That's part of what we do. So we'll be happy to help share that and keep you up front and center with the community, because I think all these reminders to help. And I think even the speaker series is a great idea. To just keep a reminder and we love information too, and it's pretty cool. And especially if you're providing it and you have other experts, and it is just a really cool space. I could talk forever, and we're probably hitting. Well, I'm way over. I already turned the clock off, so it's impossible to try. Well, maybe we'll have to do this more often, because there are numerous like history things I would just love to talk about.
Yeah.
Even Bayshore Boulevard and how that started, and being that I had the magazine, the History Focus, for so long, even the Fort Brooke, and then some of the churches, and there's just so and there's so much more. Even the Water Tower area, I was curious about. That's east off of 275.
Yeah, Sulphur Springs, Seminole Heights.
Was that some of the because. Was that around, like, what, I'm trying to think, South developed first, right? So what year,
So you think about, kind of Tampa grew in kind of circles from downtown.
Right.
And so downtown, the little village of Tampa started in the 1830s, and then really the next big kind of jump out from that, from a population density, people of course lived all around because they got little land grants and things, but in the 1880s with the railroad, you had the kind of popping up at about the same time, Ybor City, Hyde Park, and Tampa Heights. And then as Tampa Heights, because of the kind of the benefit of Tampa Heights and growing north was everything's on this side of the river, and it's not in Ybor, so you have kind of this march forward of Tampa Heights, Seminole Heights, Sulphur Springs. And then as Hyde Park grew and as more bridges came to be across the river, you had the growth of South Tampa, like Palmacia, Virginia Park, those areas. And then the 20s came, and then everything exploded after that. It's
so interesting, and it's interesting because I think we'd almost think that it would come and land, would come from north and come down, but because of them coming from the water, right? It's interesting. They came like in and sat and
exactly. The water was critical because it was really the only way to have any kind of communication or transportation. Overland travel in Florida was just miserable.
Well, and that's because Henry Plant hadn't created his railroad system
Exactly,
yet, right?
exactly.
So,
I mean, we're supposed to get the railroad in the 1850s, but it didn't happen, so we had to wait till the 1880s, so 30 years later.
And then the first flight wasn't until 1914, out in our community. So with Tony Janis, so there's just so many exciting things we could talk about. We were just at the Mahaffey, and the that it's right around the corner there.
So right there.
Yeah, it's just we're so lucky to live in Tampa. If you've not, wherever you may be, if you've not been to the Tampa community, definitely check it out, because we definitely have so much to offer here. And it's not even just the facilities. I feel like, it's the people that run them. And one of the exciting things we talked about briefly, and then we'll wrap up, is, just being able to have a choice or a say in the collections that the History Center was bringing in. That, I can imagine that's like a dream. Like,
it is.
From so many years when you start, right? And then how did you start off in the...
Well, I started working here actually before I graduated from University of Florida, because I'm from here, and so I came home for the summer after my junior year, before my senior year, and the History Center had just opened up a little preview center on Harbor Island, and so we had a very small collection and just really this kind of dream to become what we are today. And so I worked for the summer, and then they hired me when I graduated, and I went to grad school at USF, and I just kind of kept at it and rose through the ranks. But the collection, you're right. We're a pretty new institution. Like the St. Pete History Museum dates back to the 1920s. The state has had a history museum and has been collecting since, there's been a state since the 1840s. But Tampa, we've had different entities that have tried to start a museum or tried to start collecting. So the county had this thing called the Historic Commission, which started in the early 50s. There's the Tampa Historical Society, which started in the late 1970s. But none of them could really look kind of globally and pick and collect and really take care of and curate the collections as well as we can, as we've become able to. And so we've lost a lot of opportunities because there's stuff that just, there's stories about when Hyde Park began to be redeveloped in the 1970s. People would be moving into these grand houses and would just be clearing out the attics and just throwing things out, just trunks and boxes. And so just to think of all the photographs and all the interesting things that just ended up in a landfill, because at the time there was no appreciation for it, and it was just this old stuff. So we lost a lot through that.
Oh, wow.
But there's a lot of things that still percolate to the surface.
Oh, I don't know. Okay, so let's talk about that again. So they went in to clear these out after...
Yeah, so Hyde Park is started in the 1880s, and really its kind of heyday, its first heyday was like the 19-teens, 1920s. That's when most of the houses were built, between the 1880s and the 1920s. But by the 1950s, after World War II, Hyde Park kind of fell out of fashion, and living this close to town kind of fell out of fashion. You had the suburbs growing, and so by the 60s and 70s, you've got, you know, Carrollwood, and even going out to Brandon and places like that, and in South Tampa, going into the peninsula. So, so again, Pompey, Virginia Park, and Belmar, all those places that are now getting older in South Tampa, plus Davis Islands, began to be more popular. In Hyde Park, less popular. So by the late 60s and early 70s, Hyde Park was not the place to be. It was the place to avoid. There were, you know, boarding houses and just really rough. It was a rough neighborhood. And so, but it was also almost all of those houses were still there and in rough shape, but there were these kind of diamonds in the rough. So there's a historic preservation movement that kind of came across the country in the 70s, and Tampa was part of that. So these folks, some pioneering people, kind of started buying up houses here and there and fixing them up. And it became kind of started to become the place to live. Or exactly, really, they were. Well, again, you're so intent on cleaning this place up that you're not even going through the boxes because Lord knows what's in them.
And nobody was really, you know, on watch to say, let's see what's in there before the city allows. Or
exactly.
Wow, it's so interesting just how people lived before and just the, you know, the tech. Again, it goes back to the innovators that have stood up and believed in something and have really advanced life for all of us.
Exactly.
So, all right, we'll have to set up a time where we come back again and we'll pick another stories.
Anytime.
Because otherwise we could talk for a long time, but somebody might want to sit that long.
Exactly.
Although we can pause it.
Part two.
Movies,
well, exactly. It's you got to watch at your leisure.
Well, I'm again really excited to kind of watch over the fall and get involved and be involved as much as we can. Yeah. So. And again, thank you for your participation in this upcoming issue.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you. It was fun to write that article.
Again, wow, you have no idea what it means to me to have your participation. So I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been so much fun talking with Rodney again. And it is just proof. Again, 10 years ago, you know, when I started my own magazine and kind of went on this venture of, you know, I wasn't sure exactly where it would go. You just go and now to be sitting here today says something. So, you know, definitely follow your dreams. Go after, you know, if you have instincts, they're for a reason. Trust your gut and believe in yourself. So check out edgemediahub.com. You can subscribe to our magazine, and we have so much fun and great stuff. Consider becoming an annual partner. If you have any questions, you can reach out at info@edgemediahub.com. And until next time, never stop dreaming. We'll see you soon. Thanks.